I picked a topic that was very near and dear to me, which was about truth. But as I dug into it and tried to figure out what I would say here in a short period of time, it got very difficult. So I abandoned that and went to spirituality. So I know I can cover that in 30 minutes or less. And so the renaming of the title of the talk is going to be Outfitting for Your Spiritual Journey. Not that I'm a great outfitter for spiritual journeys, but I wanted to at least have something to offer you. And I think that I don't stand out as a particularly talented person in outfitting anybody for their spiritual journey. It's just that I wanted to start the conversation. So that's what I'm doing here. I think what I'd like to do is start out by grounding our conversation in conversations that I've had with people from C3 over the years, some of which took place at Coffee and Conversation, which was a 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock session that we used to have, and therefore was an opportunity to talk about anything. And there was a time when we sat around the table answering the question, what does spirituality mean to me? So I'd like to go through a few of those things that I learned as we went around the table to show the great diversity of answers that we got, and also to share with you some of the other conversations I've had just in hearing talk back and other things, and add those to the list. So the first thing was, I heard from a person that I respect an awful lot that said, when the question came, well, what does spirituality mean to me? It was, I don't even think about it. I try to get up every morning, I try to live a good life, I try to help others. The concept of now I got to think about what is spirituality and other stuff like that is just something I don't want to do. So in a sense, they're leading a good life, and that's all that's necessary. The second one, however, is probably, as I think about all the conversations I've heard from this group, many of us came from a religious tradition, and the idea that spirituality and religion could be separated was foreign to me, at least, when I was within a religious community. They were the same. And as I think about history and about go to something like 1300, when there was only, there was Rome and there was Constantinople, and they were representing the Western world in religions, the idea that we're going to separate religion and spirituality would probably feel strange. Like, why would you do that? Or what is the difference might be a better question. And then, of course, before all the explorers went out from the West and found all these islands, they were all populated with people who had religions. And there again, I think spirituality and religion was very difficult to separate. So as we look at the various views of what is spirituality, you'd have to include, since people check off, 80% of the Americans check off the box that I am religious and have a denomination, then you certainly couldn't ignore this group. Others said that I feel spiritual when I feel a sense of awe. That when I look at the world and I see these special things that go on, and even unspecial things, but I see them in a way that is that tells me that it's more than just me, that it's a big, beautiful world out there, I feel a sense of awe. And of course, there's the contemplative groups that are thinking in terms of yoga, and they're thinking in terms of meditation and other things. They're turning inward for their sense of spirituality. And so I just labeled that contemplative. Oh, I moved ahead there. Compassionate action. This was a surprise for me, but I guess it shouldn't have been. Several people around the table said, I feel a sense of spirituality when I'm doing things for others. And I didn't think about that as a sense of spirituality, but now it makes a lot of sense. But so that's just another one. And the last one I labeled alternative energy, not as in solar power, but there's a feeling that within the universe there is something else going on there, an energy that we're connecting to, that we're all one when we think in those terms, and there's something out there that we're connected to. And then I heard this morning when I raised a similar question to our spiritual inquiry group, I heard a whole bunch of new ideas, and it was kind of like too late for the slide, but anyway, there's plenty of others out there, I guess is what I'm trying to say here. So this is grounding this conversation of why talk about spirituality when we have such a diversity of views here. And I'm laying groundwork for more conversation. So I think it'd be good if you knew where I was coming from so that you'd get a sense of why is he biased in that way. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of my religious or spiritual upbringing. And then I want to talk a little bit about my intellectual development, and maybe you'll see why I'm going to be saying the things I am. So I was a middle-class white kid, a Lutheran, very proud of the fact that it was Martin Luther who started all this Protestant Reformation stuff, and I was pretty fundamental in the way I looked at things. That the Bible was written by a person who was omniscient, that person, a spirit that was omniscient, omnipotent, all-loving, and all these kinds of things. And so when I went to college, and I was kind of confronted with an alternate point of view, and I was sort of confronted with. It started with Genesis. It started with all this knowledge we know about the Earth and its development, our 4 billion-year-old Earth, and the 6-day story. They just weren't working out for me, and that was the first brick, if you will, of a wall that tumbled down. When I just couldn't justify why I would hang on to the story of the 6 days when there was so much evidence over here for 4 billion years. By the time I graduated, the whole structure had completely collapsed. And I had taken on a new attitude about things. I was kind of ticked off about having been fooled all these years. And so I had a chip on my shoulder. It might let you know how big that chip was when you find out that I used to go annually, actually semi-annually, to Holland Christian High School to lecture them for one day, a series of classes for an hour, but one day of that, where they labeled me the lion in the Daniel's den. And I would talk to the Reformed Doctrine classes. I had a friend there who asked me to come in. I think what his motivation was is that, you know how when you try to protect yourself from snake bites, you give yourself a little venom all the time? I think I was that little shot of venom so that when these seniors graduated and found people worse than I was, that they would be inoculated in some way. So that gives you an idea of where I was. Intellectually, I graduated over a number of years, I must say. This isn't just a 4-year period, but I went back to school several times, and I had majors in physics and computer science, and minors in math and chemistry. So you have a sense of, I was over on the side of the world that was describable and highly predictable. By the time I ended my career, I had jumped the fence, and I was on the social side where it made the hard sciences look easy. There was a great deal of variability, and there was no hard edges. In fact, everything was fuzzy, and you were trying to figure out how people are going to act. So I ended up with a career working in small groups as a consultant. There were international companies working on large engineering projects, and I was working with them in starting out their work, focusing on the fact that they were a group, and there's plenty of literature out there to show that groups often underperform what their potential is. That they had all this capability. In fact, they might even have an expert who had the answer, and because the other members of the group didn't believe that answer, they came out with poor results. So how is it that a group that has a combined talent pool could end up utilizing the full benefit of their members? So that's sort of where I ended up. So that kind of gives you a sense of where I've been, and that kind of sets the stage for one more housekeeping chore, which is I would like you to note that on the back of your bulletin, in our value statement, I want to look at one in particular, and that says open inquiry. Oh, one other thing I wanted to say before I left, I forgot about this, is that we had a survey which we asked all the members of C3 to participate, and this happened probably 2-3 years ago, in which people talked about their spirituality, and the question was, are you a spiritual person? And you can see that the mean score was an 8. This means that we had a chance to say either I'm a 1, which was very not spiritual, or I could be a 10, which is the maximum. People thought they were 8 as an average. So you can see that's very high. And the other thing that we asked people was, do you think C3 added to this spirituality? And the mean score was 7, so that was also very high. So getting back to the value statement, which was open inquiry, you note that there are kind of like three places to that, three parts to it. The first part, I see it as we're pursuing the free exchange of ideas. And so that gives us permission, in a sense, to ask questions that in a religious environment would be called, what's the name? Heresy. Yeah, that's right. So we get to be heretics for a little bit here, and we can ask the questions that we think need to be asked. As a good Lutheran kid, I was raised with the Lutheran Catechism. In fact, it was called Luther's Small Catechism, as I recall. And that's a book of questions and answers, which kind of puts brackets around what are the proper questions to ask, and here are the right answers for those questions. And in an open inquiry, of course, what we want to do is push beyond the questions that we were told to ask and look for answers that we need to find to answer those questions. So that's the first thing. It kind of gets permission to ask the question. The second part of that value is that we're going to explore the lessons of science, philosophy, and the creative arts, which is basically saying, look everywhere, and look for ideas using the metaphor for the spiritual journey. I found 3 areas that I think we ought to be thinking about. And first of all, what is the destination? If we're taking a journey, some will say, well, the journey is the destination. Well, now we have to answer, but others won't. So where are we heading for? And I think there's a whole lot of traps along the way we ought to be thinking about. And lastly is, so how do I evaluate new ideas? Remember, my first idea was talk about truth. Well, I worked it in somehow. It's going to be very short, though. So let's just talk about the destination a little bit. And here I turn to Martin Luther King's quote. He was talking about every man lives in 2 realms, the internal and the external. Well, that gives me a hint about where we might be looking here for this destination. So we've got the inside, which I'll call the mind, for lack of a better word. And we have the outside, which includes the universe. Sort of like what's on this side of the eyeball and what's on the back side of the eyeball, or your other senses. Now, I'm helped along with that by the etymology of the word spirit, which is breath, which came as kind of a surprise to me. But where do we find people who are concerned about breathing in the spiritual community? Yoga, meditation, other things. They're looking inward more than let's say, the religion side that I offered as a choice. And so there is a sort of a spiritual community that's looking inward to a degree. And then the idea of spirits is very externally oriented. Spirits meaning gods, devils, casting out demons, witches, miracles, Genesis. In fact, any book of orthodoxy that I've ever read, the Quran, the Bible, the Old Testament, well, we found there's a series of stories that happened where? In the world, in the universe, in the small universe, a small part of the universe, but it happened out here. And that claims were made about what was true and what was not. And almost all those claims, I think you can find some tangibility. That something was there. Like God was there. In fact, belief in a God for any number of religions around the world had to do with, I believe that the volcano God was there in the world, showing me signs of his or herself through the volcano. So there's lots of evidence that said that spirituality occurs in the world. And then there's evidence that says that spirituality belongs in the mind. So remember, this is a sketch, so I'm not going to tell you where to look. But I do know of a couple of areas to look. The second thing is, how do I avoid some traps? Now, this is an area that I know a little bit about because when I jumped over to that sociology side, this is where I found a lot of traps. And I'm just going to point out 3 of them. One is the confirmation bias. The confirmation bias is when we have a filter in front of us and it has big holes and little holes. And when I hear something that agrees with something I already believe in, it gets to go through the big hole. I don't give it a lot of look. I don't give it a lot of evaluation. If it agrees with me, I grasp it. Now, something that disagrees, they go through the little hole, and I become a lawyer. And I decide that, oh, well, you know, I can think of 1,000 exceptions why I shouldn't accept that, and I keep it out. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. I'm going to turn to Benjamin Rush. Anybody know who Benjamin Rush is? Signer of the Constitution, yes. Good, I like you. Oh, that's why I married you. So Benjamin Rush is out there. He's a very prominent man in our history. He was a signer of the Constitution. He became a cabinet member of some sort. I think he was the Attorney General or the Surgeon General or something like this. And he believed in bleeding, that practice of cutting a vein, getting rid of your bad humors. And here he was in an era when bleeding was starting to become questioned by the medical community, but he hung on to it. And you can imagine why. It's a belief he had. And so a patient comes to him, he bleeds them, and the patient got better. Why did the patient get better? Well, because he bled them, of course. Proof positive. Now another patient comes to him, he bleeds them, and the patient dies. What happened? He didn't come soon enough. Or he was so far gone that even bleeding wouldn't help. We have a story to tell that will filter out evidence that doesn't agree with what we have, or agrees with, and we embrace that which we do agree with. The second thing, which is easy, the Barack Obama is a citizen question, is first of all, I took on the belief, me meaning somebody else, took on the belief that Barack Obama is not a citizen. Probably did that for other reasons, right? Probably it worked out well with their view of life. And then they said, he's not a citizen, and Rush Limbaugh said he's not a citizen. And you said, right on, brother. And then somebody in some other news area, or the guy next to him says, yeah, he's not a citizen. Yeah, I agree with you. And all this comes in easily without question. Then comes a birth certificate. What happens? It's fake. A birth certificate, it's fake. And it goes on and on like this. So confirmation bias is we filter data to maintain the beliefs that we have. Trap number 1. Trap number 2. It's the closure principle. You've seen this in other ways, but the closure principle is a Gestalt idea that we close things. Well, let me show you. Can you see here that I have 4 circles and 2 squares? Those of you who are already set for my trap should understand that there aren't any circles, there aren't any squares, that what I have are 4 Pac-Man-like things and 4 angled things, and there never was a white square. What happened there? We completed the gaps, didn't we? We filled in the gaps, and we could do that very easily. That's part of humanity, to fill in the gaps. And I think that that is the closure principle that we want to keep in mind of when we have a gap, what do we do with it? I would like to read to you what Robert Ingersoll said about this. He wrote a lot at the end of the 1800s, at the beginning of the 1900s, and he often asked himself a question so he could answer it. So his question is, if you were, if you were to witness phenomena that seems inexplicable by natural laws, would you be inclined to favor spiritualism? He answered, I would not. If I should witness phenomena that I could not explain, I would leave the phenomena unexplained. I would not explain them because I did not understand them and say that they were a product of spirits. That is no explanation, and after admitting that we don't know and we cannot explain, why should we proceed to explain? Because we can. That's the answer, I guess. We want to fill the gap. We want to take that hole in information and fill it with gossip, right? Isn't that how gossip starts? Isn't that what they say when you are told that there's this bad news story coming out? You're a politician. They say, get ahead of it. What does that mean? That means tell your story, fill the gap before they do, because that gap is going to be worse than yours. Moving along here. The third thing I want to talk about, incidentally, there's plenty of gaps to be filled. For instance, how do we explain comets? And I think the one that I want to jump to is, how do you explain lightning? Well, in Europe, lightning was an evil thing. They rang the bells in the towers to ward off the evil that the lightning brought. Now, you might anticipate a problem with this. Now it's raining. I've got the tallest building in town, and I have a metal bell up there attached to a wet rope. And I'm ringing it, warding off. And you might guess that there's a lot of bell ringers that never rang a bell again, and that's true. And it took Benjamin Franklin and his lightning rod to stop that practice. In fact, Ben couldn't stop it. They had to get the Pope to tell them to stop, to put the lightning rods on. So the idea was that we had defined lightning as evil, and that I filled the gap in that lightning story to say that it was evil, because obviously lightning is neither good nor evil. So, the last one I want to talk about, and I want to do this quickly, is the auxiliary hypothesis. That's when I have a hypothesis that doesn't work, and all I have to do is put another auxiliary hypothesis off to the side here that makes it work. So, if I say that the Earth was designed and built in 6 days, and I have a whole bunch of data over here that says it took 4 billion years, my answer is, no problem. You're thinking that days are only 24 hours long. My auxiliary hypothesis says days were millions of years then. Now my original hypothesis can stay the same, and I can have this auxiliary hypothesis that simply makes it okay. And you can imagine how many times we do this as human beings, of add that little story on the side that allows us to preserve the story we're telling ourselves. So these are the 3 traps that I just, as the guide here, I'm trying to warn you of as we go along the way. And the last thing, I want to go back to the, oops, I guess I just lost everything. Never mind. I want to go back to the idea that, what do I want to go back to? I'm 70, how can I know? I want to go back to that guide business, and I want to go back to how I evaluate things along the way. And this is where the truth comes in. If you're a postmodern person, which almost all of us are, we know that truth got kind of mucked mucked up in the 70s or so, when sociologists started looking at scientists and saying, well, you know, they're not so special. Look at them, they're human beings doing all this human stuff. And maybe truth isn't as clear-cut as we thought it was. That every one of you are looking at this dais here, looking at this podium and saying, I'm looking at it from a different perspective. And not only that, but there's a multitude of subjectivities here. And every one of us is looking at through that lens. And therefore, how can we say that what truth is when there's just so many ways to look at it? There's no authority to go to, no answer book to go to. So how can we know what truth is? Truth is within us to decide. Man is the measure of all things, is what Protagoras said. So that's one school. The other school says there is a podium here, and it is there whether I'm here or not. And we are equipped to handle the variety of points of view here. We are able to understand that this is the same podium as I walk around it and see all these different angles. We are collectively able to say that's a podium. The truth is out there. We only have to discover it and then verify it in a number of ways. So I will leave you with, how do I evaluate things along the way? I would suggest to you, because I am that kind of person, I would suggest to you to consider that, how can I verify that it is in the world and it does exist? Because I'm filling those gaps, remember, and I'm making things up to fill up the gap. And I wonder, how do I evaluate whether what I put in that gap is real or not? So I would turn to that. So my time is running out. So I'm going to suggest to you that the spiritual journey consists of finding out where you're going, looking out for traps along the way, looking for truth. And I'll just say that as far as my own spiritual journey is concerned, I'm still on the path. I'm still trying to figure out what it is. I'm still empathetic with the first person who said, I'm just trying to live a good life here. I don't have to have something special. I'm sympathetic with voices that were in our earlier session in spiritual inquiry that said that spirituality is something yearning within me to find out, to live at a higher plane than the mundane life that we all live in normally, to raise myself up in some way. The awe aspect of appreciating, to being aware of more of what's going on out there may be all that we can expect from spirituality. I don't know. And so I will say that I could call it something else for now, but for now I'm going to call what I've just said spirituality.